from there. So Jamie was until October 2018 the Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO, where he received worldwide attention during the 1999 Kosovo War, where he served as the spokesperson for NATO. He also received his Bachelor of Arts in Modern History and French at the University of Sussex, and his Doctor in Philosophy and Modern History at Lincoln College, Oxford. Currently, Dr. Jamie Shea is a Professor of Strategy and Security at the University of Exeter and a Senior Fellow of the Friends of Europe in Brussels. His previous NATO roles, and I'm not doing him justice because there are plenty here, but just to keep it nice and short, include Director of Information and Press, Deputy Assistant Secretary General for External Relations, and Director of Policy Planning. His many academic positions include Professor at the College of Europe in Brussels, or Bruges, apologies for my French, and Lecturer of the University of Kent for the School of International Relations, and of course, arguably most importantly, a patron of Team Global as well. So very much appreciated for coming, Jamie, and please take it away. Thank you.
Well, Chris, thanks very much. It's great to see you. Great to see my old friends and partners in crime, Anthony and Lawrence again. Great to meet Hannah and the younger generation of Team. And it's great to see Team Global now. And also truly alive and kicking with so many people interested in these debates and discussions. So first of all, bravo, guys. It's not always easy in the modern world to sort of keep organizations going. COVID puts all kinds of obstacles in our way, particularly in preventing us having our usual discussion over a Trappist beer in the back streets of Brussels when you come over. But the virtual space is good also because it allows us to link up with a lot of new faces. I understand that somebody from India registered for this event. Brilliant. Be very interesting to hear later on, hopefully, if that participant is on the line, how he or she sees the challenge of China. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to appear this evening. I also know, Chris, that I imposed on you for family bereavement reasons, a last minute shift of date. I apologize for that. And again, thank you so much to all of you for accommodating me and being so kind and flexible and allowing me to, as the French say, faire amende honorable by doing it this evening instead. So 20 minutes on China and what it means for the West and NATO in particular. Well, the first thing, of course, is the emergence of China as the second sort of great, or even the first great authoritarian power in the world, alongside Russia, means that for the first time in its history, NATO needs to confront two major powers as potential adversaries at the same time. And of course, those of you who know NATO will know that throughout its 70-year plus history, NATO has had the luxury of only one challenger in one place at one time: Soviet Union, Milosevic in the former Yugoslavia, the Taliban after 9/11, Colonel Gaddafi after 2011. And when you've only got one real threat in one place to worry about, you obviously have the luxury of time. You have the luxury of being able to devote all of your intelligence resources to analyzing that one single threat and coming up with a response. But the emergence of China means that for the first time, NATO really has to simultaneously deal with these two immense beasts of the global strategic scene. And that's obviously going to impose some difficult debates between allies like the US or Canada or the global Britain post-Brexit that are looking increasingly to the Indo-Pacific, feeling that China should now have the priority. And allies in Central and Eastern Europe, you think of Poland, the Baltic states, who traditionally have had problems with Russia, and will be quite alarmed if they believe that the cursor of security of alliance attention is moving away from them towards China, particularly at the time when they see Putin sort of rattling the saber by deploying over 100,000 troops and 2 tank divisions on the border with Ukraine in recent weeks, trying to push NATO ships out of the Black Sea, and so on and so forth. So it's not going to be easy for NATO to find the right balance between these 2 focal points. And of course, the second problem is that they're very different. And I'll talk about this tonight. Russia, you could argue, is a declining power, which has a declining asset, oil and gas, but still a sizable military force and the will to use it, particularly within the region. China, of course, is a power, unlike Russia, in all of the key categories of global power today. Foreign assistance, propaganda, technology. I'll come to this in just a moment. And so you can't just have a kind of Russia policy and say, hey, that's okay for China as well, one size fits all, or vice versa, a kind of China policy and say, yeah, that's fine. We'll apply that to Russia. They require distinct approaches, which is a second problem. The third big problem that emerges for NATO from the rise of China is that Russia and China are becoming increasingly close. Putin at the Valdai conference, which he hosts every year, openly speculated on a forthcoming official Russia-China alliance. They're conducting joint exercises together. We are going to see soon if China will participate in the Russian exercises Zapad 21 in the Western military districts this year, which is worrying many of the allies. They have conducted joint maritime exercises in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Baltic Sea, in the Arctic. They've been flying joint patrols very close to Japanese airspace in the Northern Pacific. And recently they announced that they're going to launch a joint space probe to set up a space center, a space research center on the moon. Now, some of you who have a historic perspective like me will say, yes, this was tried in the past with the famous Sino-Soviet alliance of 1950, which only lasted for 6 years until Mao became alarmed at the idea of Khrushchev and the Soviet Union going soft on Stalinism, and he broke up that alliance. At that time, of course, it was the Russians who were the lead and the Chinese who were treated very much as the junior partner. Now, of course, the shoe is on the other foot. It's very much the Chinese that are in the lead and Russia is the junior partner. Whether Putin will accept to play the role of Mao is something that we wait to see. So there are some skeptics who believe that because this thing didn't work in the 50s, it won't work now. I am much more skeptical about that. I think that these 2 powers, at least in the short term, see every reason to combine against the West in furtherance of their own sort of alliance of the authoritarians. Russia has a massive dependency on China for oil and gas. The more it can sell to China in the 10 years or so, when natural gas and oil are still going to have a market value before the green revolution puts the fossil fuel industry out of business altogether, the more they can sell to China, the more they can keep their own system going. The Chinese still need the Russians for a lot of military technology, particularly aircraft engines and space capabilities and so on. And basically, they just enjoy together poking a finger in the eye of the West. So this alliance may not last forever, but I think it's going to last a lot longer than the 6 years of the Sino-Soviet alliance in the 50s. So in a nutshell, NATO has to worry about Russia, it has to worry about China, but then it has to see how it deals with the combination of this growing rapprochement between these 2 great powers. So this is going to impose a much greater level of complexity in devising NATO policy to what we've seen in the past. Now, what makes China formidable? Well, the first thing is that China has studied the Soviet Union very closely. It studies everybody very, very closely. You know, the Chinese have been studying us for generations before we began, just in recent years, to start seriously trying to understand them. And from their understanding of countries, particularly the Soviet Union, they know why authoritarian regimes have collapsed in the past. You know, they've looked at what Gorbachev did in the Soviet Union, particularly starting political reform before economic reform, and they are determined that they are not going to make those mistakes again. And they are determined that whatever happens, the party is going to stay in power at any price. And they have all of the technologies of social monitoring, of social control, of maps observation, the social registration scheme to keep their population in line. And they have the tools of economic growth, unlike the Soviet Union, to keep that population well-fed and relatively happy. So the first thing is that China is going to be around for quite a long time to come. It has its internal weaknesses. We can talk about them in the Q&A session. But basically, it has sort of studied how states survive transitions and transformations. It has debates, only within the Communist Party, but real debates take place there. And it seizes on reform quickly in order to move forward. So China is not the Soviet Union. It's not going to be sort of dragged down by the revolt of nationalities on the periphery in the way that the Soviet Union was dragged down. China, with the Chinese Han population, is a much more coherent state. And any sources of nationalist opposition, whether they come from the Uyghurs or the Tibetans or tomorrow the Taiwanese, let alone the democracy movement in Hong Kong, is going to be brought into the line very, very quickly, even with repressive methods. So that's the first thing. The China is an intelligent authoritarian state. And this is new for us because we've dealt throughout NATO's history with what I would call dumb, if I can be quite provocative here, dumb authoritarian states that didn't have the wherewithal or the intelligence or the big data analytics to be able to spot problems ahead of time and move quickly to stay on the right curve of history. You know, the authoritarians that we had to deal with, the Milosevic's, the Saddam Hussein's, the Colonel Gaddafi's, were easy opponents in that respect. That's the first point. The second point is that China is the second most successful capitalist country that we have so far known, but it's communist. This is important because that means that China plays on both sides of the fence. It is sufficiently communist, and it's the Communist Party which is in control and shows no signs of giving up the game, which allows it to be at the forefront of a third world revolution, preaching a different system, a fairer system to that of the West, and to offer an alternative economic and social model, which the Chinese claim is more stable, more predictable than the chaotic American capitalism. Look what happened outside the Capitol on the 6th of January. Look at the polarization. Look at the police, Black Lives Matter. God, do you really want to live in that declining, horrible country like the United States where the politicians can't solve anything? So they use their communist identity to push the sense that they represent, like in the the struggles of the 1950s, a different approach to economy, to society, which ultimately delivers the goods and is more successful. And for many countries in Africa and Asia, that's appealing, very, very appealing. And the Chinese donate through the One Belt, One Road initiative billions of cheap loans, infrastructure programs and so on to make that transition to the Chinese model all of the easier. And they don't ask pernickety, pesky human rights questions or World Bank style conditionality before the loans are handed out. They're attractive in a way that the Soviet model beyond the 1950s never was. But China is also a capitalist country. It has got everything that capitalism has in the sense of a consumer society, educated workforce, first-class university education system, a high, first-class technology, innovative technology. It's spending much more than we spend on 5G telecommunications, on biotechnology, 4 times what the United States has been spending on artificial intelligence. And it also feeds the capitalist market, particularly by buying up cheap American treasury bonds. So that means that the Chinese are able to play in the capitalist world. None of us, as we try to recover from COVID-19, are able to give up access to the Chinese market. China, the first country to go into COVID, it was the first country to come out with the least social impact of any of the major powers in terms of loss of life and economic disruption. And at a time when we're struggling to sort of get back to zero. The Chinese are growing by 6 to 8% already a year. Not quite, the 10 to 16% that they were used to during the days of the great opening of the 1990s, but would you not like in the UK to have 68% a year? So they are able to play in both worlds simultaneously, again, in a way that the Soviet Union, which until Gorbachev only had 200 private companies in the entire country and sold nothing to the West apart from oil and natural gas, never could. There are other things about China also. A lot of Western intelligence operatives like to say, that Russia is a kind of, rainy day. China is climate change. In other words, it's a systemic competitor in every area in a way that we haven't been used to in the past. In the past, we've been used to ideological adversaries, economic rivals, military rivals, but we haven't sort of had all of them combined into one and able to play in all of these spheres simultaneously. China is the first adversary that can basically compete with us everywhere at any time. Number one, it's becoming a significant military power. It's just launched its second aircraft carrier, built by itself, unlike the previous one, which was bought from Ukraine. It has its own stealth fifth generation fighter aircraft. It's developed a significant missile capability. It's increased its nuclear weapons now up to about 260, learned to launch ballistic missiles now from submarines and the rest. And it's carrying out, as we see recently over Taiwan with the air operations interfering in Taiwan airspace, with the missile tests, with the deployment of the Chinese Blue Water Navy. It's carrying out a constant, very high tempo of exercises to maintain a high state of readiness. It's not yet the equivalent of the United States, but the head of the US, the incoming or outgoing, head of the US Pacific Command, who handed over command last week in his farewell speech at the Pentagon, expressed a great deal of anxiety that by middle of the century, the Chinese in numbers of ships, in quality of ships and so on, with their standoff missile capabilities will be the equivalent, if not the superior to the United States. And this will make it increasingly impossible for the United States to operate close to China, ergo to defend countries like Taiwan or Japan or Vietnam or South Korea or others. So this military modernization is proceeding apace. I mentioned the Chinese aim to be dominant in many of future technologies. And to some degree, the great decoupling which Trump brought into the economy, where Trump tried to decouple US technology from Chinese technology by no longer allowing Apple, to provide apps to Huawei, or by not selling semiconductors to China. In the short term, this has set China back, but it's also given President Xi the notion that what he has to do is to develop a national sourcing, a domestic sourcing for these products. So in the short term, Trump might have hit China, but in the long run, by decreasing their reliance upon Western technology, he's going to hasten the day in which the Chinese have their own autonomous eco technology system, as they do, for example, by having their own internet search engine, Baidu, their own social media companies, so that they can operate those behind a great firewall, which keeps many Western media, more recently the BBC International News Channel, and Western internet sites out and so on. China is increasingly looking to dominate global supply chains through its acquisition of ports. It owns already about 15% of all of the ports in the European Union, like Trieste, Genoa, Piraeus, high stakes in Antwerp, in Rotterdam, and in fact, COVID, the pandemic, was an interesting eye-opener to the extent in which China has now started to dominate many of these global supply chain and production chains, particularly when it comes to transport links, when it comes to investment in roads, highways, telecoms, particularly port facilities as well. And now the West, particularly in the European Union, United States, is coming up with this new notion of reshoring, trying to identify to what extent it's wise to continue to be dependent upon these globalized Chinese-controlled supply chains, like in pharmaceuticals, like in PPE, personal protective equipment, ventilators, and all of this, vis-a-vis ramping up or restarting production chains at home to be able to handle with greater autonomy the next pandemic that's coming along. The next thing about China, which is interesting, is it has soft power. Yes, it does. China knows that to be a great power, you can't just bully your neighbors, although the Chinese, of course, are quite good at that. Look at what's happened to Australia or Taiwan in recent times. But that you also have to have a more attractive side. And COVID has been a magnificent opportunity for the Chinese by handing out free supplies of Sinopharm or Sinovac, the vaccines in Eastern Europe, in the Balkans, throughout Africa and in the Middle East, at a time when the Europeans have had trouble, as you know, being able to supply their own markets with Western approved vaccines. This has been a boon for Chinese diplomacy and to show the soft power, China as the good neighbor that comes to help you when times are hard. They're also very present in the hybrid warfare space. COVID has shown an ugly side where the wolf warriors, I don't know if you're familiar with this term, but these quite aggressive spokespeople, I was never like that, Chris, when I was the NATO spokesperson in the Chinese Foreign Ministry, have been much more aggressive in hitting back at the West for the criticisms, particularly over things like Uyghurs or Hong Kong or their attitude towards Taiwan and so on. So they've learned the lesson from Russia that disinformation, propaganda, confusing the narrative, playing in the Western media space. This has a negative side, hybrid tactics, but they're also trying a more positive side. They've set up China Global TV, which the UK has recently banned because of failure to correct inaccuracies, but which is still active throughout Europe. It doesn't necessarily have a high viewership, but like RT, the Russian TV station, the Chinese have put a lot of effort in to particularly relay through sympathetic, Western academics and the fellow travelers, as we used to call them, their particular sort of view of the world. Like Russia, they would say there is always another side to the story. Don't believe what your government tells you. It's a lie. And let us present the view of the world from Beijing as well. So in a nutshell, China is probably the most formidable competitor that the West has faced since Nazi Germany in the 1930s, because it has this kind of ambition to spread its values and ideology around the world. It believes that it represents the future, and decadent Western capitalism, think of Hitler, represents the past, and it tries to offer a model of success that people, as they despair about the inadequacies of Western government and of democracy, which has failed, will increasingly be tempted to follow. Now, of course, that is the positive side, if you like, of the Chinese challenge. But the Chinese also have shot themselves in the foot a little bit because, during COVID, they have also shown the other side of the story. And the West has started to push back. There's been a kind of awakening in the EU, in the Western world, in the United States, not exactly to follow the old Trump line of seeing China as an enemy and going for a kind of neo-containment or a new Cold War. Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, said in London just this week that the US does not certainly see China in those Cold War terms. But as the EU would put it, certainly not seeing China just as a trading partner and a source of cooperation, but as a systemic rival. This is the term that is increasingly being bandied about. And the sense that the Chinese have sort of overreached has led now to a distinct reaction. And this is global, which is not necessarily good news for China in terms of creating too many enemies too quickly. I mean, first of all, obviously the United States has now woken up to the Chinese competition in a way that after the Sputnik Sputnik launched in 1957. Suddenly, bingo, the United States woke up to the technological space competition from the Soviet Union and then launched the Apollo program to get back on top. And Democrats and Republicans in the United States differ about most things, but they agree when it comes to the fact that the US has to respond now more aggressively to the challenge of China. But in Europe as well, you know, you had in the last couple of days something unthinkable, which is the EU imposing sanctions on 4 Chinese officials and 2 state entities because of the repression of the Uyghurs. This led to the Chinese putting sanctions on 5 members of the European Parliament. But that now has led to the European Parliament suspending the approval of the EU China Investment Pact, the CIA, the Comprehensive Investment Agreement, which the EU spent years trying to investigate. So why would the Chinese put sanctions on 5 MEPs, knowing full well that that's only going to torpedo a beneficial investment pact with the European Union? You know, the UK and Canada have followed on in the first ever sort of joint transatlantic sanctions imposed on China. The Australians have now started to punch back as well. The Philippines this week swung from China back towards the United States after complaining about the numbers of Chinese fishing boats near the reefs that the Philippines claims. There is almost a kind of universal sort of sense of now being much more cautious and vigilant with China. The Indians, of course, had a bit of a wake-up call when they had some border clashes up in the Himalayas recently with China on the disputed line of control. The Indians retaliated by banning a large number of Chinese apps. So, you know, as the Soviet Union found out, even if you are a formidable power, it's not necessarily a good idea to have so many adversaries all at once as well. And that means that the West and NATO are now coalescing around a new sort of tripartite policy towards China, which is largely shared in the UK. Look at the results of the integrated review in the EU. Look at the Commission China strategy published in 2019. Look at the United States. It's based on the notion of cooperation. Yes, of course, we should cooperate with China. Why would you not? And indeed, you know, the US has demonstrated that compartmentalization, putting issues into different categories, can work. For example, John Kerry was recently in Shanghai, and despite this being the height of you know, the US-China spat over the Uyghurs and the sanctions, he was able to get a 600-word memorandum out of the Chinese pledging that they would work together on climate change. And 2 days later, guess what? President Xi attended Joe Biden's Earth Day summit in Washington and spoke and has pledged to decarbonize by 2060. The Chinese have been very cooperative over dealing with piracy in the Gulf of Aden, sending ships. The Chinese have been cooperative over Iran with the conclusion of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The Chinese have signed up to UN sanctions against North Korea, although there's a lot of suspicions that they are secretly aiding North Korea by buying its coal and sending it foodstuffs. So, you know, do not rule out the possibility that the Chinese will be equally pragmatic. They also want to show that they're good citizens, and things like climate change and piracy give them an opportunity to do so. So the cooperation plank is definitely still there. But now we have containment. And the sense that, you know, just like the Soviet Union, even if it's not the Cold War, the West needs to look at what it can do to make it harder for China to take risks militarily and use its power aggressively. What has happened here is similar to what happened with Wilhelmine Germany at the end of the 19th century. This is an analogy which is frequently drawn, but as a historian, I think it has some credibility, because, you know, the hope was at the end of the 19th century that globalization, free trade, which was very strong at the end of the 19th century before the First World War, would sort of make war impossible because economic interdependence would be too strong. And then very late in the day, you know, after the German naval build-up in 1890, we recognized that although that logic was strong, there was also coming out of the Kaiser's Germany a countervailing logic, which was based around a very nationalistic military caste in Potsdam, which had a much more sort of alarmist, skeptical view of the world and of Germany's decline, of the need to seize opportunities while the correlation of forces was still in its favor. And when it came to crisis management, that nationalistic military caste got the upper hand over the economic sort of bankers and traders. And that, I suppose, in containment, the belief is that we're replaying that kind of syndrome today. And that therefore we now have to start putting in place a series of measures that would make it harder for China to sort of lash out, even if it wanted to. For example, the Americans are stepping up arms sales to Taiwan and diplomatic relations. Japan, India, the US, Australia have formed a quad structure, integrating their naval forces in the Indian Ocean, in the Atlantic as well. You know, the Chinese, the South Koreans are investing in ballistic missile systems. You know, we don't yet have a kind of NATO for the Asia Pacific in terms of a formal structure. And indeed, many of the Asian countries are as much interested in an OSCE type structure, a structure which would embrace China in a security dialogue, because they want to trade with China after all, rather than a structure like NATO for the Pacific, which would be there to contain. But one does see sort of lots of elements now of an attempt to sort of decrease vulnerabilities towards China. For example, screening of Chinese direct foreign investment, the way in which the Americans have reacted very aggressively against the participation of Huawei in Western 5G technology, arguing that the data would be supplied to the Chinese government, and persuaded many countries, including the UK, not to go down that route as well. And then there's the competition track. Now, this is, to my mind, the most important. Basically, there is a realization that we cannot out-compete, if you like, confront China. You know, getting into a Cold War arms build-up, a syndrome where the only way out is to have a big war to decide things is in nobody's interest. The cost would be absolutely horrific. And basically, if the Chinese model is successful, it's because they've sort of outcompeted us in areas where we used to be good: engineering, science, technology, innovation, you know, new materials, the biotech area, AI. You know, this used to be our strength for education. And if you look at the UK Integrated Review, it talks more than anything else about technology, co-creation, innovation, you know, particularly in the wake of the Oxford University AstraZeneca vaccine development. Biden is now talking about the same thing in the United States. There's a strong sense that to if you like, win the competition against China, that is not a military arms race. It's rediscovering the roots of our own economic competitiveness. You know, Biden talks about a foreign policy for the middle class. Everything's got to benefit, even greening the economy, technology, jobs, and so on. So, you know, we're going to beat the Chinese by becoming ourselves again, you know, overcoming the polarization, getting rid of the old smokestack industries, going for the green technologies, becoming the great innovators. In other words, having prosperity without production. Prosperity without production, because that, of course, is what has led to the pollution of our economies. Now, so in other words, for NATO, the third pillar, which is systemic competition, depends upon, can the West therefore organize itself to win that competition? Biden is talking, and I could talk at length about this. I don't have time this evening, guys, because I'm going to finish in just a moment. But Biden has talked interestingly about, you know, sort of integrating more the European and the US economies. You know, we're not going to go back to TTIP, the old trade and investment pact, but we are looking at, you know, digital taxation, you know, more transatlantic data exchange, lifting tariffs like Airbus tariffs or car tariffs. You know, if we can really, you know, come up with the same legal regime we can trade more with each other, get rid of those protectionist barriers that Trump put in. So in other words, we could have a globalized transatlantic technology market. And if we start growing by 5 and 8% a year again, we can win. I mean, you've got to remember one thing, although the Chinese economy is now growing level with the US economy, if you look at per capita GDP, the American figure is $63,000. The Chinese GDP is $8,000, which puts it between Montenegro and Indonesia at the moment. So we have to keep things in perspective there. So in other words, and this is the camp that I'm in when it comes to, if you like, cooperation, containment, and competition, the answer lies in the competition area. We have to beat China at its own game, and therefore demonstrate that at the end of the day, it's democracy with all of its failings, as Winston Churchill pointed out, that delivers the goods. Now, final 2-minute remarks, and then we go to questions. Consequences for NATO. Well, basically, there is a choice for NATO, which it's going to have to confront when NATO has its summit on June the 14th this year, when Biden makes his first visit to NATO headquarters. NATO's been doing a lot to study China with 42 different threads of analysis, and that study was agreed by the heads of state and government at the summit in London in December 2019. But now it has to go beyond trying to understand China and playing catch up. As I've said, the Chinese have been studying us for generations, to draw the policy consequences. And essentially, there's sort of a choice here. There's a choice which says that China matters only when it comes to us. As the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, has said, why are we concerned about China? Well, because it's in our neighborhood, it's come to us. We didn't go to it. In fact, we're withdrawing from Afghanistan. So NATO's footprint in Asia is going down. But Chinese have come to us. I mentioned those military maneuvers. I mentioned the port investments. I mentioned the direct investments, the 17+1 dialogue that China has every year with 17 EU member states in Central and Eastern Europe. The recent one was just a couple of weeks ago. The One Belt, One Road investment. Italy was the first G7 country to sign up to One Belt, One Road. The notion that China will finance Britain's high-speed rail links or Britain's future nuclear power and so on. And therefore we, because China is in our area in all of these various manifestations, not least of which are cyber attacks, we have to have a strategy to reduce Chinese leverage over us by increasing our resilience, seeing where those vulnerabilities lie in critical infrastructure, in foreign direct investment screening, in supply chains, in redundancy, in pre-stocking equipment and the rest. And basically, we have to devise a strategy which cooperates with China, but makes it impossible energy for China ever to blackmail us. And where do we draw the line between what is perfectly acceptable investment? Any company can invest in any other company, nothing wrong with that, but where it becomes potential harmful interference. Is it, the Germans have had this debate, the Germans started with 10%, now they've raised the bar to 25% of foreign ownership, where they do not allow the investment to go ahead. The second part is that those in NATO say, no, the Chinese challenge is so strong that we have to go to Asia, like the UK aircraft carrier, the Queen Elizabeth, with the Carrier Task Force on its maiden deployment, going off on May the 22nd to the South China Sea, calling in the Asia Pacific in the way with a Dutch frigate. The Germans, the French have sent frigates, even the Belgians have sent a frigate to the Indian Ocean. We have to be present militarily alongside the United States in the Indian Ocean. We have to partner with the Asia Pacific democracies. We have to build a kind of an alliance of democracies around the NATO core, increasingly integrated, so that we can also play a role in the containment of China. But there are countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, and I'll finish on this, that again worry that this could be a big diversion of resources. If the UK is sending its ships to Asia Pacific, they're not going to be in the Baltic area or the Black Sea to defend Poland or Romania. Of course, what if, we're there when the war breaks out here? The question of priorities, is the US really looking for NATO to play a military role? in the Asia Pacific, or would the US be happy for NATO simply to take care of Europe while the US deploys itself more resources to the Asia Pacific, a kind of transatlantic division of labor? So, China at home or China away, to use football parlance, I think is the big choice that's going to come up at the NATO summit. As I've said, the allies have spent a lot of time studying China, but now they have sort of put themselves under pressure to do something about it. But I think they're waiting a little bit for an American signal, what the US sees NATO's particular added value as being in this area. That will be then hammered out in a new strategic concept to be issued next year, when finally we should have some answers to all of these difficult questions. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jamie. Much appreciated. And we've had some brilliant questions coming in, so very much appreciated from everyone so far. I suppose what we can do is, once, if anyone's happy to, feel free to turn on your cameras. Lawrence, I noticed that you have a hand up there. Would you like to ask a question? Start us off.
Could I ask you, Jamie, two things? One, to comment on New Zealand and whether it has been shown to be bullied too far. And secondly, the persecution of the Uyghurs and the damage this is doing to China's perception in the Muslim world. Is this part of her learning from the USSR, or has this another part of the China's strategy towards the world?
Lawrence, thanks for that question. I realised that I spoke too great a length. I apologise for that. So given the limited time available, I'll answer the questions very, very fast. Number one, New Zealand. Yes, it's worried about antagonising China because it's a small country, a lot of Chinese investment, and doesn't want to antagonise China more than it needs to. Yesterday, New Zealand refused to sign a Five Eyes declaration. The Five Eyes, of course, intelligence sharing agreement, criticising China. New Zealand refused to sign. Its excuse was that the Five Eyes was all about intelligence sharing and shouldn't become a new kind of, G7 kind of forum, which would deal with political issues and issue declarations. But I think you're right, Lawrence. I think it's a sign that in New Zealand, they take, unlike Australia, which has been, heavily bullied by China, particularly after Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, suggested that the Chinese should open an investigation into the Uyghurs. The Chinese overreacted, as they often do. They tend to use a sledgehammer to crack a nut by banning Chinese beef and wine sales. So Australia and China have sort of burnt their boats, but New Zealand is still trying to keep a good relationship with the Chinese. They also know that the Chinese are very heavily investing in the South Pacific Islands, where the New Zealanders also have responsibilities too. So it's an interesting case. The Uyghurs, I agree. And I said this, I think the Chinese see that the Soviet Union, like so many multinational empires, think of the Ottomans, were brought down, by their rebellious nationalities. They're determined to avoid that at all costs. They do worry about the Uyghurs and independence movements. That's why they're being so tough on Turkey to expatriate Uyghurs who are resident there. They also worry that the Western withdrawal from Afghanistan will lead to the return of Al-Qaeda and ISIS to Afghanistan, and that those movements will particularly support Uyghur terrorist movements, which will then become more of a threat to China. The Chinese would have been more than happy to see Western troops staying in Afghanistan forever to keep that alliance between ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Uyghur separatists at bay. So two quick answers there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jamie. So we'll roll on to a few of the questions that we've got now. So grouping both Manuel and Mike's question together, they ask how NATO would or should position itself in the possible event of an attack on Taiwan from China. And do you think that Xi Jinping is being so aggressive to deflect concern from internal political problems?
Oh, yeah, those are really good questions. You may have seen The Economist this week has a very good analytical piece on all of this. Yeah, I mean, if you ask most American strategists, where's the next war coming from? They will say China will try to take back Taiwan. It's dealt with Tibet, it's dealt with the Uyghurs. It's recently dealt with Hong Kong, through the national security law, taking advantage of the COVID crisis, but and that's been, at least in its own eyes, in clamping down on the opposition, successful. So what's left at Taiwan? Now, Taiwan, of course, is more difficult, but Taiwan is in a weak legal position because so few countries recognize it. It doesn't have a formal military alliance with the United States, just a weapons support agreement. And of course, China is so much more militarily powerful. So if Xi, does show an appetite for risk taking in the way that Putin is showing an appetite for risk taking, and particularly if Putin is keeping the West occupied, if they do this in a coordinated way by Putin keeping us busy, with troops in Ukraine and all of that, while the Chinese do a grab for Taiwan. Then the Chinese feel that they could potentially get away with it. They know that they would pay a very, very stiff price, but they see that with Russia having occupied a great portion of Georgia and Ukraine, it too has paid a price, but it's been able to ride out sanctions over a period of time while not giving up any of the territory that it's acquired. So what's the answer? Well, of course, the answer is that the United States has got to make a Chinese invasion of Taiwan as costly as possible, and that's the direction the US is going in by freeing up the export legislation so that Taiwan could get F-35s. And, this upset the Chinese big time, but the Americans have decided, forget it. It's more important to give the Chinese most modern military weapons, even if Beijing doesn't like it. Secondly, to try to, in advance, spell out to Beijing, as we've been trying to do with the Russians, such a massive packet of sanctions, like with Russia, we're going to cancel the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, we're going to take you out of the SWIFT banking clearance system. Do you really want to do it? So to try to put in place a kind of anticipatory deterrence by spelling out in advance all of the consequences in a way that makes the Chinese think again. Again, the Chinese are rehearsing the invasion of Taiwan using Hainan Island. So they're certainly, getting themselves into the posture that they could do it. But whether they're really doing this to make the Taiwanese back down, they've recently re-elected a pro-independence president and try to get Taiwanese politics to, go back to the Kuomintang, the original nationalist movement, but which has become more pro-Beijing in recent years. So Taiwan goes back to being, very docile sort of self while retaining a degree of autonomy. That's what they're seeking to do through military pressure, like Russia is trying to get Ukraine, to stop trying to move towards the West by rattling the saber. Or whether they really want to reoccupy it, we don't know. But I tend to be rather gloomy on Taiwan, because I think so far, the lesson of the Chinese, particularly on Hong Kong, where they were not prepared to allow one nation, two systems to operate. The Taiwanese have taken also the conclusion that the Chinese are not allowing one nation, two systems to operate. But whether they will be able to increase their defense in a way that makes it too risky for China to attack is a case in point. But the most important thing for the West is, unlike with Crimea in 2014, not to be caught by surprise, not to be caught napping. I think NATO showed, if I can say so, over the last couple of days in dealing with the Russian build-up on Ukraine, that by getting to it early, knowing what's happening, doing a load of different things, sending a load of signals, you could ultimately persuade the Russians to back down. And I think, not having an intelligence failure over Taiwan, waking up one morning to be taken by surprise and seeing the People's Liberation Army parading down the Central Boulevard in Taipei, that is going to be the most important thing. So I don't have a really good answer for you, but I think, in terms of major conflicts, that is by far the one that all of the experts are pointing to at the moment.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jamie. And we have a question from Keith here. So he moves towards more of a North Korean issue. And he says, surely the main concern for NATO in the destabilization of Southeast Asia is the threat from North Korea with its nuclear weapons. Is it at all likely that China will seek to curtail that threat, or will it wipe its hands with the North Koreans?
Well, again, Keith, great question. I mean, I think the Chinese don't want North Korea to collapse because they probably are frustrated with Kim Jong-un as much as everybody else. But North Korea under Kim Jong-un, fellow communist, represents a buffer state vis-a-vis South Korea. It means that they don't have American troops on the Yalu River like they had the last time when General MacArthur, on an ill-fated expedition, went there during the Korean War in 1950. And, you know, the Chinese still believe in communist ideology, even with their own particular interpretation, and don't necessarily want to see a communist state fall any more than the Soviet Union allowed the communist state in Afghanistan to fall in 1979. They invaded to stop that from happening, as you well know. So North Korea, I think, is convenient to them. On the other hand, it's true that they have in the past been willing to participate in so-called 6+1 talks towards limiting North Korea's arsenal, towards freezing it, and the rest. My sense is that, you know, they don't have an interest in North Korea gaining nuclear weapons because, you know, they want a North Korea which is a predictable partner and element. So having North Korea on the threshold of nuclear weapons, I think, is more useful to them than actually having North Korea as a nuclear state. But they will want the West to give up any ideas of regime change, and they will want the West to do much more towards lifting sanctions on the regime, I think, before they'll put serious pressure on the regime. For the time being, they do enough to keep the regime poor and dependent on China. But in terms of, you know, as I said, coal, oil, food supplies, they do enough to sort of keep it alive. They also really do worry that, you know, that if North Korea collapses, rather like East Germany in 1990, they're going to have millions of, you know, starving North Koreans pouring across the border into China. They're more likely to go there. Many of them work there already, so their family ties, and this is going to be a big humanitarian burden on them. But it's a very interesting case because, you know, the Chinese are with Korea, North Korea, a bit like the Pakistanis are with the Americans on Afghanistan. You know, they do enough to be cooperative while always pursuing their own very separate agenda.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jamie. And going on to Josh's question now. So he says that the core of Putin's popularity with the Russian people is by embracing Russian nationalism and the Orthodox Church, in comparison with Xi Jinping and China being an atheist state and having its own nationalist agenda. Could this drive a wedge between both Russia and China?
Yeah, that's an extremely good question. I mean, Xi's popularity, I think, is based on, you know, the state performance. You know, COVID, look how quickly we dealt with it. You know, albeit by imposing, you know, an extremely severe lockdown. You know, shutting off whole cities. You know, so the state's efficient, the economic growth. You know, he has to have that obviously to provide jobs. You know, rising prosperity. That people are willing to give up sort of personal freedom, like freedom of speech, in return for security and prosperity and efficient state. And so far, you know, that equation seems to be working, including vis-a-vis the younger generation. Although, you know, what doesn't always come out, though, is that those things are working in the cities. The countryside is much more impoverished, much more rural. And there have been a number of, you know, quite significant rural protests against the regime in recent times. And we learned from the Soviet Union that states that we thought were totalitarian and where the KGB, you know, had the population under control, were in reality much more fragile to popular protest at a certain level. So we could still be surprised at what happens to China. But again, the Chinese have studied the Soviet Union and Gorbachev and Perestroika and Glasnost, and are very determined that it's not going to happen there. But they're worried, you know, they're obsessed with insecurity, the way in which, you know, they demand loyalty from ethnic Chinese living abroad, from Chinese students being sent abroad, you know, shows a regime which feels on one hand so secure, on the other hand is very insecure, because if you're feeling so secure, why are you obsessing about, exerting social control over, the millions of ethnic Chinese in Singapore, throughout Asia, in India, in so many other Africa, so many other countries of the world. So we do need, I think, to look beyond the facade of total control and look at where some of the instabilities lie. So Putin, yes, has made his appeal, if you like, to a kind of ethnic Russian culture, which is based on sort of recovering the lost provinces, Ukraine, Georgia, Nato-Russia, what used to belong to Russia in the Tsarist Empire, reuniting, Russians living abroad. I think because the Chinese population is so diverse and spread across the world in a way that the Russian population isn't, Xi is not going to come up with a nouveau China policy of, taking over Singapore or any area where there are significant sort of Chinese population. So it's not a question of expanding, if you like, territory, but very, very, very much using technology and other instruments to ensure the loyalty of Chinese minorities, Chinese populations living abroad, and making sure that they serve the purpose of the Chinese economy. So it's like a virtual empire. Somebody has spoken about the Uyghurs as a virtual concentration camp, and I would argue it's more like a virtual empire where you're looking not so much at territory, but influence through technology and values and cultural alignment, with a certain amount of intimidation as well, all based on a high degree of data acquisition and manipulation. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jamie. And just in the interest of time, I'll try to group together a couple of questions here.
Okay, and I'll end on that one with apologies for not having been able to take on more. Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you. So, yeah, sorry, did you just mention that you're happy to have a couple more questions? Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so Richard and Nathan talk about how is NATO the right organization to create a strategy to approach China? And Nathan kind of asks if NATO should invite Asian members to join the alliance.
That's a good question. Well, NATO cannot invite Asian members to join because the North Atlantic Treaty limits it to European countries, which means that Ukraine, Georgia, yes, could join theoretically. And NATO has promised them that they will one day. Sweden, Finland could join. Countries in the Balkans like Bosnia could join, but essentially that would be it, because Article 10 limits the membership to European countries, together with the United States and Canada. So NATO could develop partnerships, and certainly that's what the Secretary General is talking about when it comes to Asia Pacific, deepening cooperation. You've heard of the Partnership for Peace and all of the military exercises and training and consultations that take place. The sky's the limit there. It's going to be interesting to see to what degree the Asia Pacific countries really, see that partnering with NATO is going to be useful for them in terms of their own security in the Asia Pacific, vis-a-vis the traditional reliance upon the United States and the American Fifth Fleet and the rest. The second aspect to the question, it was this, idea of, can NATO be the sort of crux of a new Asia Pacific sort of security system? Well, I think, it's not so much that it's going to be built around NATO. I think there'll be selective participation by NATO member states, France, Germany, the UK sending ships rather than NATO as such. But I think, NATO wants to show that, some of the things that it's developed for Europe, like partnership mechanisms, the NATO-Russia Council, where NATO was even able to set up a council with an adversary and still, come to agreements on transparency, on exercises, a dialogue. I used to chair the NATO-Russia Council on Terrorism, which went brilliantly because, the Russians didn't like terrorists any more than we did. So I think, NATO wants to sort of show that the example of a kind of collective approach to security, even having councils with adversaries, can be be something that could work in the Asian Pacific area. So it's not so much that NATO wants to build a security alliance with Asia, it's more that it wants to sort of show its model as something that the Asian countries could potentially emulate as they try to build a more cooperative sort of security system in their own area. But one question, Chris, that has come up is whether NATO should establish a NATO-China Council like the NATO-Russia Council, because, you know, we can't, you know, deal with China forever and never talk to them, right? You know, we've had an adversarial relationship with Russia while still talking to them, signing arms control agreements, you know, having fireside chats in Geneva for years. And so we have to at least have a chat with China, if only so that we understand them better and they understand us better. But I'm not sure if NATO is ready to take that step. For example, I mentioned the very negative perceptions that the military have with each other, and the NATO Supreme Allied Commander has a hotline with the chief of the Russian General Staff, and they meet quite frequently in Kazakhstan, you know, just to sort of talk about, you know, threat perceptions and what irritates them about each other. But they do talk, and it's a crisis management mechanism. And so NATO, even if it doesn't have a NATO-China Council, could at least establish that kind of hotline sort of mechanism. Yeah, so that would be my very good question. Really very interesting question. That'd be my answer there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jamie. And I suppose we'll end on this question from both Josh and David, kind of bringing it back home to the UK, and what role might a global Britain have in confronting an increasingly aggressive China? And David asked that question in terms of the Indian Ocean. And can global Britain offer any resistance to a global China's activities in the Indian Ocean?
Well, you know, I think that, you know, sending an aircraft carrier is a good gesture. It shows that, you know, the UK is taking the Indo-Pacific seriously, that it has a capability that it can actually get there, you know, unlike all of those aircraft carriers of France and Italy that have broken down in recent years and haven't really been able to deploy for very long. So, you know, the UK with 2.2% of GDP on defence, you know, we're modernising the Royal Navy, the Air Force, although it's cutting elsewhere, of course, the army and old aircraft and old tanks and so on. But you know, the UK wants to show that it does have the capability to actually get there, and it can be a player in Asia. But of course, one visit by an aircraft carrier isn't a strategy. And I think what the UK needs to do in the Asia Pacific is say, well, look, you know, one swallow doesn't make a summer. We can't deploy an aircraft carrier every year. So, you know, basically, you know, apart from, you know, showing the flag every now and again, what is our strategy? It cannot be a go it alone strategy, that's clear. It has to be a strategy where the UK works with its European partners. After all, you know, France is a Pacific power. It has far more Pacific possessions. I've been to Tahiti for my holidays, so I know than the UK does in the area, you know, with military bases. The Germans have sent frigates. You know, they trade with China. You know, the EU has a Asia Pacific strategy. So, you know, it's not as if the UK is the only European country that's woken up to the importance of the Asia Pacific. The Germans do far more trade with China than we do. So I think what the UK has to do is piggyback, not just alongside the US, but alongside the Europeans in the Asia Pacific, use diplomacy and economic instruments, soft power, you know, British culture, norms, values, as much as it uses military power, and put the aircraft carrier not as the only part of the strategy, as impressive as it looks on TV, but embedded in a much broader, you know, more long-term strategy for how it's going to exert a pacifying influence in the region. But it has to do it as part of this sort of, you know, comprehensive approach. Global Britain means, you know, Britain interacting with more partners across the globe, not Britain being a global power like in the 19th century, you know, when Rule Britannia dominated everything and the British Navy ruled the world. No, it's got to be now, you know, how Britain fits in with existing frameworks and amplifies its role and influence through partnering with others. And, you know, that's got now, after the aircraft carriers come home and hopefully had a successful trip, we've now got to sort of, you know, devise that longer term, more diplomatic strategy. Guys, I'm sorry I have to disappear, but the questions were great. And you were a fantastic audience. And I greatly enjoyed having the opportunity to talk to you this evening. Hopefully I can come back again before I really have to retire. Thank you again, Chris. Thank you, Lawrence.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Thank you very much for everyone coming along. Thank you very much, Jamie. Much appreciated.
God bless you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jamie. Speak to you soon. And thank you very much for everyone for coming. This will be recorded and uploaded on our website. And if you do want any other information on Team Global, feel free to get in touch with myself. And Anthony, would you like to say a few words?
Well, I thought that was an extremely good, an amazing rundown of the situation between China, Russia, the UK and the European Union. And incidentally, the Economist magazine for this week is really well worth getting hold of, because it's got a piece about Taiwan and whether it's possible for the US to continue what their foreign policy is in that area, and that is the ambiguous relationship between Taiwan, the US and China. In other words, not taking any sides. So it'd be interesting to see how that develops, because there's no doubt about it, the Chinese have now got 397 naval vessels. They vastly outnumber the Taiwanese. Taiwan is an extremely difficult place to invade. It's got very steep cliffs and mud flats, so there's only one or two areas where the Chinese could possibly invade, and the only real defense I think the Taiwanese would have would be to buy large quantities of mines to put in the sea for any incoming invasion. But I thought the whole event today was extremely interesting, and there's so much information there that I'll be looking forward to listening to it again on the YouTube channel. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you very much, Anthony. And yeah, if anyone has any questions or wants to learn more about Team Global, feel free to get in touch through my email, through the website. And yeah, I hope you have a great evening and look forward to seeing you all very soon. Thank you.